All right, welcome back to the Copywriters Podcast with your host, the world's greatest copywriting coach, David Garfinkel. David, how you doing today, man?
Nathan, I'm pretty good. How about yourself?
I'm doing fantastic, and it looks like we've got a pretty special surprise lined up for the listeners today.
We do. Our guest today is a copywriting historian and eight-figure practitioner of direct response copy. His name is Sean Vosler, and I've wanted to have him on the show ever since I saw some of his detailed, comprehensive mind maps on Facebook connecting early pioneers of advertising to the world of today. Now, here on Copywriters Podcast, as many listeners know, we have our Old Masters series, and we've gone as far back as 100 years ago to the 1920s. But Sean has some great information that was new to me as of this week to important influences and people back in the late 1800s. Sean's also the founder of Increase.Academy and author of the best-selling guide, 7-Figure Marketing Copy, and he specializes in helping businesses scale to 7 and even 8 figures. And we're going to talk about a bunch of things today, including how he scales businesses with direct marketing copy. But just as important is his unique and penetrating research back into the 1880s and 1890s, where he is on a mission to find out how we got to where we are today in the world of direct response marketing. Of course, one of the reasons Copywriters Podcast got to where we are today is this: copy is powerful. You're responsible for how you use what you hear on this podcast, and most of the time, common sense is all you need. But if you make extreme claims and/or if you're writing copy for offers in highly regulated industries like health, finance, and business opportunity, you may want to get a legal review after you write and before you start using your copy. My larger clients do this all the time. So, Sean, welcome, and thanks so much for being here.
Dude, I am honored to be here. So excited to share some nuggets on what we've been doing on the research side of the nerdy history side of this stuff, and kind of the journey that got me to exploring that.
Cool. Well, we're at a point now where the pandemic and restrictions are coming to an end. And you told me when we were having a chat to prep for all of this that you can't wait to go to New York City. And it's not for a Broadway show. It's not for the pizza. It's not for a bagel. Would you mind sharing with us to start why you're going there?
Yeah. So, there's been, I tend to get on these research bins, and, for writing my own book, it was this whole thing. But then I started exploring this whole concept of where all these ideas in direct marketing and copywriting, whether it's online or off, where they all came from. And in New York City, to sum it up, they're in the New York Public Library, off in their hidden archive somewhere, there's a book I'm really looking forward to finding. I haven't been able to find online. It's the only one in existence that I know of, and it's written by. It's the first edition or the first part of a bunch of books written by this guy named Charles Austin Bates, and it's a name you won't hear a ton of. He's in, if you Google him, he doesn't really even have a Wikipedia article, but he is in the quote unquote Advertisers Hall of Fame. And he's in a lot of footnotes in a lot of books about marketing, but he's actually written tons and tons of content. He has a 1,100-page book on copy and direct marketing from 1902. And then he had the one I'm really looking for is the first of his periodical. If you're familiar with like Printer's Ink around the turn of the century, there were a lot of these periodicals, right? And there's one that's out there that I cannot find, the first of 12 written by this guy that's in the New York Public Library that I'm going to go get as soon as it opens back up. And I'm in California, so it's going to be a bit of a hike, but it's going to be fun to find it for sure.
It sounds like it's worth it, especially for what you're doing. Why don't you tell us about some of these really old masters, and maybe we could start with Charles Austin Bates, what you found out about him and why you think they're so important.
Sure. Yeah. And, in the show notes, we'll try to link to the mind map I've been working on of this. I'm calling it the lineage of thought to give it a really dramatic name, but the idea is, mapping out where in the 1940s and 50s where they started using the terms, unique selling position. In the 1920s, really the reason why advertising terminology came around. In the 1930s, the idea of products as personalities started. Where all this stuff came from and why it started being used and how it was used. So that started me on a journey of like looking back through time, trying to find the earliest bits of information I could find on certain things. We're all familiar with AIDA, right? Like the actual framework that a lot of marketing is derived from. The first kind of rendition of that I found was 1902 in a book that's sitting on my shelf. And I was surprised to find that a lot of this stuff was starting to churn up in the late 1800s. So the people around that time who were practitioners of this, they weren't even really called copywriters at the time. That term wasn't used as much as the term. It was either like admin or ad writers. But there's a few names that stick out, and they all kind of come back to a central point that a lot of us look back to, which is the fella named David Ogilvy, in the 60s, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And a lot of his influence, it's funny, you'll find him quoting a lot of people. And if you trace it back and keep going back to the people, like he said, a big influence of his was Claude Hopkins, right? Scientific advertising, huge influence to us, of course, today too, mainly because he wrote a book about it and we still have access to it. But if you look at it, like who was Claude's major influences? And if you keep going back, you start to find a few key figures that were kind of the father figures of much of the direct marketing pieces that we see today, or the tools that we use. And I mentioned Charles Austin Bates at the outset. He was one of the first people to start collecting the information about what makes advertising work. And his big influences around the time was a fella named John Powers, who has a lot more written about him. And he actually I was literally just looking at this book called Scientific Advertising Origins, which is kind of the history of Claude Hopkins and Lasker and those guys. And it noted out Claude Hopkins was actually taught by John Powers. So there's all these different connections, and the further back you go, the more entwined all these stories start to get. And there's a few good books written about the early days, but they generally kind of glaze over that time period. So I'm really interested in seeing where those all stem from.
What's like one great takeaway you got from John Powers or from Bates?
Yeah, so Powers and Bates, they kind of come from this new school of thought at their time, which was, advertised based on they were probably the first ones really to facilitate the reason why advertising. Like they just told people why they should buy stuff, which, seems pretty obvious today. Like here's the features and benefits, right? Like, here's a hair blower. It will dry your hair quicker, and you will be able to have better hairstyle, right? Like just tell people what it does. But at the time, that was pretty revolutionary, because before then, you had people who advertising was mostly in the realm of what they called patent medicine, which was kind of the early day, like, put cocaine in a bunch of water and charcoal together, and you've got, this new revolutionary thing that cures baldness or whatever, right? and that was really the earliest realms of advertising as we might consider it today, where in newspapers, these patent medicines would advertise. And regular businesses didn't advertise as much. In fact, I was mentioned to you this yesterday. Most banks didn't like to loan to companies who did advertising, like 1860s and 70s, because they thought basically their rationale was if they have to advertise, their product can't be good, right?
Oh, we cannot approve this loan. You're an advertiser.
Yeah, exactly. So there was the earliest advertising firm in the United States wasn't founded till around 1870. And you would think, companies, even at that time, Industrial Revolution was going pretty strong. I assumed that advertising had gone since way before then, at least in the way we would understand it, but it really wasn't. There wasn't as much. There was instances of advertising being used, obviously, but it wasn't really formalized until about the 1880s, where it really started getting some traction, and companies started realizing, like, hey, if we tell people about what we're selling, they'll come and buy it, as opposed to just walking by the store and seeing it and buying it. And that was pretty fascinating at the time, like seeing, wow, who knew, right?
Yeah, I mean, advertising today is international. Even Ogilvy has branches and offices all around the world. Maybe not all around the world, maybe not in Russia, for example, but in India and Singapore and all over Europe and, of course, the UK. But I'm getting the sense from you that advertising as we know it today really started in America. Is that a fair thing to say?
Well, it was kind of like, the discovery of the atom bomb was going on in Europe and in the United States at the same time, but separate, but at the same time. There was advertising. In fact, the first real kind of examples of traditional advertising was by this guy named Thomas Barrett. And this was in the early days. He made ads for soap, and this was in the UK or England. I'm not sure it was the UK at that time.
I think it was England.
Yeah, something like that, right? So he was really one of the first folks to start doing advertising. But at the same time, it's around the same time companies on both sides of the Atlantic started seeing that they could influence people to buy their products. And it was mainly done through newspaper advertising and then magazines and periodicals as time went along. But then also it really started gearing up in the 1890s when it started to formalize as more of more agencies started going. James Walter Thompson, who, that agency is still running today. It is one of the top 10 agencies in the world. That agency he started in about 1865. He started working with one of the first agencies out there. But yeah, it was on both sides of the Atlantic. But as it started getting more formalized, this is where folks like Charles Austin Bates started coming in, and Printers Inc., which was a periodical at that time. I've got a few. My goal is someday to own all the Printers Inc. bound volumes. But if you've ever seen them in a library, if it has the whole collection, it literally spans. It ran from, I think, the 1880s to 1960s, and it's like a whole 30, 40 foot shelf of bound volumes. Yeah, it's wild.
So you were telling me yesterday about an ad that was like disarmingly transparent, almost frighteningly honest, that was, I think, Bates or maybe Powers did. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so John Powers, he was really if you look him on Wikipedia, he's given the title the world's first full-time copywriter. Or might be Wikipedia or one of the books I got around here. So he really was the kind of first practitioner of advertising for just kind of normal products, right? Like like clothing and just everyday products, where before him, there was a few instances of it, but for the most part, it was like patent medicine and kind of snake's oil stuff, right? Or the circus, so they called them powerisms later on, where he just made it almost like news. It was just here's what's going on, hyper transparent. And he was in one of the top paid individuals in the United States in the 1800s. Like he, I think it was in the top 20. I'd have to verify that, but he was a millionaire as a copywriter because he could just bring tons of business, because no one was doing advertising. People didn't really get it at the time. So he would actually partner with companies. He was one of the first maybe JV brokers back in the day, you would say. but he'd take part of the business that came in. So he would work with department stores and things. The specifics of one of the first ads that he started running with was interesting in the sense that it literally was, the company came to him and said, hey, we're overstocked. We've got too much of this product. We can't seem to move it because people don't know we have it. Something like, it's just this like list of like what sounded like bad things, right? And he wrote the ad literally just what the guy told him. And they were so pissed at him because they're like, you can't say that. You can't say that we're overstocked and that we're selling it at a discount because we have too much of it. But the next, over the next few days, they completely sold out of the stock, because really what he was doing was giving the public a reason why they should buy this thing. And that was fascinating to me to look at it and say, we're still doing that today. We're giving people a reason why they should buy something, whether it's, we're doing a limited time deal, a discount, or a special offer, bonuses, whatever it is. We're really just giving them an excuse to buy. And that was revolutionary at the time when John Powers was doing it, but it was hyper transparent. It's just, here's what's going on. And that influenced Claude Hopkins, obviously, a ton. And then, David Ogilvy was obviously the famous ad man from the 60s. He was hyper influenced from Hopkins. So it's all kind of this downward train of thought back to these guys in the 1890s who really had the just started that movement.
Okay, that's great. And, you told me, we were talking yesterday, many people believe that nobody understood what advertising was in 1904, 1903, and Johnny Kennedy, the Canadian Mountie copywriter, is sitting in a saloon on North Michigan Avenue, and he sends a note up with the bellman to Claude Hopkins. I know what advertising is. If you will meet me in the saloon, I will tell you. So he says, he says it to Lasker, and then Lasker comes down and he says, it's salesmanship in print. And and the whole world changed. Like all of the dead trees of winter suddenly bloomed with these green and gold leaves, and business with apparently wasn't quite that way.
Well, that story, whether it's editorialized or not, history can tell us. But Lasker, for those who aren't familiar, he ran one of the most successful agencies in the early 1900s. But they advertised as much for themselves and how awesome they were than just about anybody else at the time. So they were good at sharing that story, and they paid Johnny Kennedy really well. Like, he was one of the best paid copywriters, but they made sure clients knew that too. The association that they paid him, so I think it was like $750,000 a year, something like that, which at the time was just insane, right? But the result of that was they were able to basically say, we've got the highest paid copyists in the world, we're going to get you great copy. And they did great work. You can go and I've got a collection of a lot of their ads and stuff, but really at that time, not to undervalue their quality, but it was like, if you did advertising, you're going to beat your competition, because normally they weren't doing it. So, Procter & Gamble, those kind of companies at the time who really were doing a lot of advertising, it was, to use the kind of, shoot fish in a barrel kind of stuff. But yeah, that great story of the Canadian Mountie, down at the bottom of the saloon, I found that such an awesome story. In fact, it's in the Scientific Advertising Origins, which, that story is told by Lasker, because Lasker published these, were called the Lasker Talks or something like that. Mm-hmm. And he tells that story a lot. But Johnny Kennedy, he's kind of set up as this mythical Canadian Mountie who, was just off in the wilderness and, had this realization of, salesman in print. Well, if you start digging into it, there's not much written about it, but I came across in my ADHD fueled, read everything I can written by these guys. In Printers Inc., actually, there's an article, because Charles Austin Bates, who I'm kind of obsessed with, he was an ad critiquer. for Printers Inc. So he was one of those, and it's still done a lot today. He would find advertisements, write about what was good about them, what was bad about them, to educate people in Printers Inc. And if you go back far enough, you'll find, I should pull it up. I should have been able to get you the exact date, but there's a critique that Bates did of Robert Kennedy's work way before he, positioned the reason why advertising. And so there's this connection there. And then Charles Austin Bates has a 1,100 page book from 1902, and then another book from 1896, where he basically coined that term salesman in print when he was teaching about what copy is. And, so Kennedy's generally given the credit for that, but I tend to think it was Bates, not that it's dramatic in the sense that, at the time it probably would have been a big deal, but for now, who cares? I mean, it's just stories, right? But I found that fascinating that there's that connection there, and there's not much written about Bates. I hope to write a book on him one day.
It's interesting. That would be like me saying, well, I invented the bullet point, and then we, create all of this mythology around it. And I may have actually, with, my templates, I may have actually improved it a little bit, but I sure as hell didn't invent it. All right. So, I am very curious as to how you got into all this, because you didn't start out as a copywriter, did you?
Right. Yeah. So my own journey into this realm of the nerdy stuff we've been talking about with the history of it was born out of my own little journey of becoming, by accident, really a copywriter. to put it, simply, I started in the technical world. I was a website builder, and I got in the world of just literally just agency work of building out websites. I didn't even know what the term copywriter was, or copy, or anything like that. So earlier, probably 10 years ago now, I just literally set up WordPress sites for people. And I tended to find the clients that were happiest and the ones that, always paid their bills on time and didn't complain and didn't nitpick every little, shade of color on the website, were the ones who had great content on their website.
Well, you had some pretty famous clients, didn't you?
Yeah. So after the agency stuff, then I started working with internet marketers. At that time, I didn't know really what that was either, but I saw this guy named Lewis Howes, sitting in an infinity pool in New Zealand. And I basically, it's like that scene of Wolf of Wall Street. I was like, whatever that guy's doing, I just want to do that. I don't know what he's doing, but I want to learn it. Right. So I stalked him and his business partner for a couple, 6 months to a year, just trying to add value, and started the conversation. And eventually they hired me as a web tech. And so I helped build a lot of their funnels and things like that. But that kept going forward, building out websites. And I was still more on the building side than the writing side. And then I got to work with a fellow named Andy Jenkins, who just brilliant marketer, who unfortunately recently passed away. And at the time, his business partner, Mike Phil-Same. So they hired me as a web tech. And that's really where I started getting my education of, here's how messaging works, right? Here's why we're using this.
Did they train you? Was it all by you observing and analyzing, or sometimes would they explain stuff to you in conversations? I mean, how did that go?
Sure. So at first it was more like, we're doing these launches and making a bunch of money. And it was more like, every hand on deck. And sometimes they'd be like, put a Sean headline in there. And that was kind of the term of like, it's going to be a crappy headline, but we need something in there. Right. And so at the time I like, you don't know what you don't know. Right. And over time I started getting it just was more absorbed. And then Andy personally started helping me understand the mechanics of it all, and how how this headline helped people come down the page to read the messaging, and we made it entertaining so that people would watch it, and all the different things that go to drive a direct marketing piece, and even branding to a certain extent. And then after that, I started doing more of the same kind of stuff. But now that I knew how it all worked, I started transitioning into doing it profit share only. So I would build out funnels and webinars and do all the copy stuff and build out the tech. but I started working with folks like Ty Lopez and Sam Ovens and a lot of these guys who in their own rights are brilliant marketers. But I was able to help come in and facilitate some new copy pieces and webinar pieces on a profit share. So really had to put my money where my mouth is, right? Because I couldn't just get paid to write a thing. I had to get paid, I had to make it work, and I had to bring, the traffic and stuff like that too.
There's nothing like having your feet to the fire, right?
Exactly.
I mean, I don't mean this the wrong way, but do you think that Andy Jenkins, when they said put a Sean headline in there, eventually started to have some pity on you? He said, no, I really
maybe. Yeah. Well, it's like they didn't hire me for that, right? They hired me for tech, and it was more of a, we just, we had a good relationship near the end of my tenure with them. And I was just very curious, and they would go on their little rants of getting the launch ready. And I just sit there and listen. I didn't really understand, all the terminology and stuff, but it starts to get in there. And then the studying really started for me, because I was like, I started writing out standard operating procedures, or whatever you want to call them, of my own, because I would, for like folks like Ty Lopez, I'd be writing 5 or 6 emails sometimes a day just to get like content together, right?
Wow.
And I wrote very, very long content, even in emails. It wasn't like, but anyways, it worked really well. We did, lots of sales for high-end products. So I started to create like my own little templates of here's what to do, so I could do it faster and for more people. And that's really what birthed the book, because I had a lot of these processes that I used in my own business.
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and how people can get it?
The book itself was the culmination of, like, I think it's safe to say I'm doing okay at this. I'd like to help other people. And that's really where the birth of it was. So I started collecting a lot of the methodologies and digging into the deeper parts of it. As you put your book together, it's like, as you start to teach it, you learn it even better, and recommend that to everybody. Right. And they can pick up a copy. We have a special link just for you guys, Sean.co/copywriting podcast, all one word. Put it down in the show description and stuff. But
Sean.co Copywriters Podcast, right?
Yes, correct. We'll make both work, just in case.
Okay.
With an S and without, they'll both work. But the book itself, it's really geared towards entrepreneurs who they may not be full-time copyists, but they're looking for strategies that they can start implementing pretty quickly. So there's a lot of the book is front loaded with a lot of just like shortcuts and templates and like just strategy guides. But then in the second part of the book, I really get into the psychology and the depth of what makes it work for those who are maybe a bit more advanced in the copywriting world. But that's really what drove that dive into the history of this stuff, because I wanted to know where it came from, right? Like, it's fascinating as you start looking into this world. It's been going a long time, and it just keeps evolving. And, folks like yourself, in modern day, just masters of the craft, are moving it forward, but we're still able to look to the past to pull a lot of great concepts and knowledge out of these masters from 120 years ago now.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the one thing anybody in any market, whether you're an Instagram influencer or a hardcore direct marketer, the psychology is the same. And once you master the psychology, you can go this way, you can go that way, you can go that way, go that way. Give us the link again, if you would.
Sure. Sean.co, so SEAN.co/copywriter podcast.
Copywriters
with or without an S, both work.
Oh, okay. Very good. All right. We'll have multiple things. Well, great. Nathan, you've been patiently flying the wall. You probably have a million things running through your mind. Want to share any of them?
I just want to say that I'm looking forward to getting my hands on a copy of the book and Yeah, I've just been quiet because this is such a fascinating topic to me. So thank you, Sean, for first of all, for coming on and sharing your story with us, but also for putting together this work, because I feel like it's going to be something that a lot of copywriters out there find incredibly valuable.
Yeah, Nathan, you love history anyway, right? You love all the historical stuff. I bet this is driving you crazy just hearing about all these books that you can't even get. Even Sean can't get his hands on.
Yeah, but I'm going to definitely get my hands on Sean's book. Sean, one more time before we're out of here, where's the best place for people to go to find out more about you and your work?
Sure. So the book link there is sean.co/Copywriters Podcast. And, if you want to just connect with Facebook's probably the easiest way to just, if you want to interact, I interact a lot on there. It's facebook.com/Sean Vosler. And personally, I love just connecting with folks who find this stuff interesting, but understand that a big part of their business is the messaging, right? And any business owner that's been doing this long enough, knows that the product needs to be great. There's no doubt that's just the base level today. So a lot of times the way you've got to stand out is elevating your messaging. And the better we get at that, the more people we can help and the more influence we can build with the people we need to help. So appreciate you guys having me on, helping me bring that message out to the world, and look forward to keeping the conversation going.
Yeah, thank you. Me too.
Until next time, if you want to catch more episodes of this podcast, you can head on over to copywriterspodcast.com. We will see you next time.
See you next time.